Hello, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the place where the past moves slowly, gently, and without any sudden excitement. If you're winding down for the night, or looking for something calm and steady to help you drift off, you're in the right place. Tonight's journey takes us to the middle of a muddy field, where knights are yawning under their helmets, and commanders are quietly grumbling about supply wagons. The battles of the Middle Ages weren't all clashing swords and galloping horses. In fact, what really happened in a medieval battle might surprise you, or better yet, it might just put you to sleep. If you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like and subscribe, only if you're awake enough to remember, of course. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's begin the long, slow march into medieval battle. Before the first sword was drawn or the first arrow loosed into the air, the majority of medieval battles were shaped by something far less exciting than combat: waiting. In truth, most soldiers spent far more time standing around than they did actually fighting. And so, to understand what really happened in a medieval battle, one must begin not on the battlefield itself, but in the days, or even weeks, leading up to it. These days were filled with slow, repetitive tasks that, although dull, were absolutely essential to the process of war. Everything from securing food supplies, maintaining equipment, and marching across vast stretches of land occupied the minds of the men who would eventually fight. And those long stretches of time were rarely filled with anything that would look impressive in a painting or a movie. For the average foot soldier, a medieval campaign began with a summons. This could come from a local lord, a king, or a feudal overlord, depending on the specific structure of the region and time period. Many soldiers were not full-time warriors, but part-time fighters drawn from the peasantry. This meant that a man who had been tilling fields in the spring might find himself carrying a spear by summer. Once summoned, he had to prepare for the journey to join his lord's retinue. That might involve gathering whatever basic weapons or armor he could afford, which was often minimal. A padded garment known as a gambeson might serve as his only protection. If he was lucky, he might have access to a helmet. A spear or a short sword would serve as his weapon, and if he had no blade, a farming tool might be repurposed for war. The journey to the site of a battle was often long, and logistics were a constant concern. Armies had to march slowly, especially when accompanied by carts, wagons, livestock, and pack animals. Roads were often muddy and poorly maintained. Rains could slow progress to a crawl, while dry weather could make dust a constant irritation. At night, the army would halt to rest, setting up a makeshift camp in open fields or forest clearings. Tents were a luxury few could afford, and many simply slept on the ground. Fires would be built, if wood could be found, and food would be distributed, usually some combination of stale bread, cheese, and dried meat. Water, too, had to be sourced from nearby rivers or wells, and contamination was always a risk. While marching, the army remained organized in loose units. Nobles traveled with their own retinues, which might include a small group of trained men-at-arms, a squire or two, and possibly a few archers. Knights, contrary to romantic images, rarely rode into battle at full gallop from the start. They often dismounted to fight on foot, especially when facing large infantry forces or defending fortified positions. Their armor, though impressive, was heavy and exhausting to wear over long distances. Horses had to be cared for just as diligently as men, and their needs for food, water, and rest limited how far an army could travel in a day. Upon nearing the site of an expected battle, tension began to build, though in a slow, creeping way rather than a dramatic one. Scouts would be sent ahead to monitor enemy movements, and commanders would convene to determine the best terrain for engagement. The location of a battle was often not chosen at random, but was the result of days of cautious maneuvering. Armies preferred to fight on favorable ground, high terrain, dry fields, or areas protected by natural barriers. Sometimes, one side would dig in and wait, trying to lure the enemy into attacking on their terms. Other times, days might pass with both armies camped near each other, each trying to outweight or outmaneuver the other. This waiting period could be excruciatingly dull for soldiers. Discipline varied by army and time period, but many medieval commanders struggled to keep their troops from wandering off, getting drunk, or starting skirmishes of their own. Morale was constantly in flux. Rumors spread easily, and fear could infect the ranks. Disease, too, was an ever-present threat, especially in crowded, unsanitary camps. With little to do but wait, talk, and tend to equipment, soldiers often grew anxious or bored. Training was minimal in most cases, so some men passed the time trying to practice with their weapons. Others played dice, told stories, or simply lay in the grass staring up at the sky. For the commanders, the pre-battle period was a flurry of logistical planning. They had to account for food stores, water access, weather conditions, and the positioning of troops. Messages had to be sent, either by runners or mounted messengers. Maps, often hand-drawn and wildly inaccurate, were consulted. Ranks had to be organized. Archers were usually placed at the rear or flanks. Infantry formed the core of the army. Cavalry was held in reserve for charges or flanking maneuvers. Flags and banners were used to signal commands during battle, so making sure the correct standards were assigned and visible was a key concern. Everything had to be arranged ahead of time, because once battle began, communication would become nearly impossible. Night before the battle brought its own rituals and routines. Many soldiers prayed, whether alone or in groups. Clergy might walk through the camp offering blessings. Others tried to sleep, though anxiety often made that difficult. Armor had to be checked, weapons sharpened, and plans reviewed. Some wrote letters to loved ones, though literacy was rare among the lower classes. Fires burned low to avoid attracting enemy attention, and sentries kept watch in case of a surprise attack. Horses were tethered nearby, saddled and ready. Even after all this preparation, a battle might still not occur. One side might retreat overnight. A truce might be negotiated. A sudden rainstorm could render the battlefield too muddy for combat. And so it was that many so-called battles, in medieval chronicles, actually ended without a single blow being struck. But when battle did come, it was rarely a glorious or organized affair. Instead, it was the messy culmination of many days of tedium, planning, discomfort, and uncertainty. Understanding what led up to the clash of arms is essential to appreciating what really happened when medieval armies met in war. Because, in truth, the battle itself was only a small piece of the story. It was built to top days of slow walking, grumbling soldiers, aching feet, and the persistent buzz of flies around unwashed camps. And when dawn broke and the horns sounded, it wasn't heroism that most soldiers felt. It was mostly exhaustion, hunger, and the hope that they might still be alive by nightfall. But the real action, if it could be called that, was just beginning. When dawn finally arrived on the morning of a medieval battle, it often did so quietly. There were no dramatic trumpet blasts echoing over hills, no heroic speeches shouted from horseback, and certainly no synchronized charges at the rising sun. Instead, the day began with the dull clanking of armor being strapped on, the rustling of canvas as tents were packed up or abandoned, and the nervous murmurs of soldiers who had not slept well. The grass underfoot was often wet with dew, and the sky might still be streaked with mist. Horses snorted and shifted restlessly, men coughed into their hands, and the camp slowly came to life in anticipation of what was to come, if it came at all. One of the first orders of business was to get the troops into formation. This might sound like a straightforward task, but it was often anything but. Medieval armies were not standing armies in the modern sense. They were temporary assemblies of men pulled together from various places, often with little cohesion or experience fighting as a unit. Nobles brought their own men, each with different levels of training and equipment. Some groups knew how to respond to basic commands, others did not. There was no centralized uniform or standard system of communication. Instead, formation was achieved through shouted orders, waving flags, and the ringing of bells. Messengers ran from one group to another, trying to get everyone into the right place, while commanders rode back and forth shouting instructions that were frequently misunderstood or ignored. The arrangement of troops depended on the type of army and the specific battle plan, but certain patterns were common. Infantry typically formed the bulk of the army, grouped in large blocks or lines. These foot soldiers were often armed with spears, pikes, or swords, and they stood shoulder to shoulder in close ranks. Shields were raised, helmets adjusted, and eyes squinted toward the horizon. Behind them or on the flank stood archers or crossbowmen, whose job was to weaken the enemy before the main engagement. Farther back, the cavalry waited, mounted and armored, often restless and eager to move. These mounted knights were the most prestigious warriors on the field, but they did not simply ride in from the start. They were held in reserve, used strategically when an opportunity presented itself. Assembling all these components took time, a great deal of time. A medieval army could take hours to form up into proper battle lines, and the process was frequently interrupted. Equipment malfunctioned. Soldiers wandered off. Horses needed to be reshod. Armor had to be adjusted. There was shouting, arguing, and often a degree of outright chaos. The larger the army, the greater the confusion. Commanders became increasingly frustrated as their carefully rehearsed plans dissolved into a tangle of miscommunication and delay. Sometimes, formations had to be abandoned altogether in favor of improvised strategies. The battlefield was rarely a neat chessboard. It was a lumpy, uneven field with mud pits, bushes, rocks, and dips in the terrain. Positioning troops on such ground required patience and compromise, not perfection. Meanwhile, the enemy was doing the same. Across the field, another army was struggling with its own issues. Smoke might rise from cooking fires, messengers galloped between tents, and banners flapped in the breeze. Neither side wanted to attack too soon, and both hoped the other would make the first move. Psychological tactics came into play. Some armies tried to look larger or more disciplined than they really were. Rows of banners were raised to make it seem as if more men were present. Trumpets were blown, even if the players had no formal training. Lines were shuffled and reshuffled to appear more threatening. In some cases, dummy soldiers, scarecrow-like figures made of sticks and armor, were placed in ranks to give the illusion of additional troops. The waiting could stretch into hours, and even then, no one knew when the actual fighting would begin. It was not uncommon for one side to delay an attack due to superstition. If the stars were not favorable, or if a bad omen had been seen, a bird flying the wrong direction, a broken sword hilt, or an accidental injury in camp, a commander might postpone battle until conditions seemed more auspicious. Religious leaders might offer last-minute blessings, hear confessions, or lead prayers. In highly pious armies, priests or monks marched with the soldiers, holding crosses and chanting. These rituals provided comfort to some and anxiety to others. For many soldiers, the long wait before a battle was worse than the combat itself. The imagination could be a cruel enemy, conjuring visions of injury or defeat. Food and water were also considerations. Some commanders allowed their men to eat a small meal before battle, but not enough to make them sluggish. Others withheld food to keep soldiers alert and aggressive. Hydration was important, but overdrinking could lead to discomfort during the fight. Soldiers often relieved themselves just before forming up, though the lack of privacy meant this was done wherever space allowed. Armor made such tasks difficult and awkward, and it was not uncommon for knights to begin the day already chafed and irritable. Aches, hunger, and nerves combined to make the average medieval warrior far less heroic than tales might suggest. Once formations were finally established, the waiting resumed. Men stood in lines for what felt like an eternity, sweating inside armor, gripping weapons that grew heavier by the minute. Some whispered to each other. Others stared into the distance. A few shut their eyes and muttered prayers. The noise of an army waiting to fight was a strange symphony, the clatter of metal, the creak of leather straps, the soft murmur of voices, and the occasional whinny of a horse. From time to time, a commander would ride along the line offering words of encouragement, though these speeches were usually short and pragmatic rather than grandiose. "Stand firm," they might say. "Hold the line," or simply, "Don't break." The weather played a major role. Rain could delay a battle for hours or even days. Muddy ground was dangerous for cavalry and made movement difficult for all. Wind could affect the range and accuracy of archers. Bright sun could blind soldiers facing east. Fog could obscure vision, leading to confusion and accidental collisions. Every element of the environment had to be considered, and nature rarely cooperated. Even when both sides were ready and willing to fight, the landscape often had the final say. If, at long last, both armies were in position and conditions were deemed acceptable, the commanders would issue the signal to begin. This might be a trumpet blast, a shouted command, a raised banner, or a signal fire. But even then, not everyone would move at once. Orders took time to travel down the line. Some units began moving while others remained stationary. Archers might begin firing before the infantry advanced. Cavalry could jump the signal and charge too early. Coordination was difficult, and chaos was never far behind. The first few minutes of a medieval battle were often marked by confusion, false starts, and miscommunication. And then, just like that, the line began to move, slowly, unevenly, and with a great deal of noise. Shields were raised. Spears pointed forward. Feet stomped through the grass. Arrows whistled overhead. The once still army became a seething mass of motion, dust, and determination. But even then, the enemy might still not respond. Feigned retreats and false charges were common tactics. One side might advance only to stop short, hoping to provoke a premature response. This cat-and-mouse dynamic continued until one army committed fully, at which point the battle would finally, truly begin. But even now, hours into the day, with both armies formed and movement underway, the actual fighting was still only moments away. What had already transpired was a complex ballet of preparation, positioning, superstition, and strategy, a slow-motion drama that played out not in furious action, but in long hours of standing, waiting, and wondering. And for the soldiers in the ranks, it was not glory or excitement that filled their minds, but the dull ache of anticipation and the quiet, persistent hope that the coming storm might somehow pass them by. When the first lines of soldiers finally met on the battlefield, it often lacked the cinematic grandeur that modern depictions suggest. There were no elegant sword fights between noble opponents, no slow-motion charges with heroic music swelling in the background, and certainly no carefully choreographed duels. Instead, the beginning of a medieval battle's physical engagement was abrupt, disorganized, and alarmingly loud. For the men in the front ranks, it was not a clean, graceful clash but a sudden, jarring collision of bodies, shields, weapons, and raw human noise. Dust kicked up from trampling boots and hooves. Metal rang out against metal. The grunts, cries, and shouts of hundreds or even thousands of men filled the air, not in harmony, but in a discordant chorus of stress and survival. The first contact between armies typically came from the infantry. Long spears and pikes met in the middle as the front ranks pushed forward, often hesitantly at first. Soldiers were not eager to be the first to fall, but neither could they afford to hesitate for too long. As the distance between lines vanished, the momentum carried them into one another like a slow, grinding wave. Those in the front felt the pressure from behind as more men advanced, and soon they were pressed tightly against both their enemies and their own comrades. Combat in these moments was rarely about finesse. There was no room to swing a sword in a wide arc or to step elegantly aside. Instead, it became a matter of pushing, shoving, thrusting, and staying on one's feet. The ground beneath them turned quickly from grass to churned mud, soaked with sweat and sometimes blood. Balance became difficult, vision was obscured, and the noise was overwhelming. Weapons mattered, of course, but not always in the way people imagine. A sword, while useful, was often not the primary weapon of foot soldiers. Spears, pikes, axes, and simple maces were more common and more practical in close quarters. A spear could be used from behind the front line, allowing multiple ranks of men to stab forward in unison. Pikes, long, two-handed spears, created walls of sharp points that were difficult to penetrate. Axes and maces, though shorter in reach, were effective at smashing through armor or breaking bones. Swords, being expensive and requiring more skill to use effectively, were more common among officers or knights. Still, in the chaos of the clash, weapons often became secondary to raw strength and determination. A soldier might lose his spear in the press of bodies and resort to pushing with a shield, punching with gauntlet fists, or swinging whatever object he still had in hand. The front line was the most dangerous place to be, and it also had the shortest life expectancy. Soldiers in these positions often fell quickly, either wounded or simply knocked down and trampled. Once on the ground, a man's chances of getting back up were slim. Armor could protect against slashes and thrusts, but it also made movement difficult. If a man lost his footing and fell beneath the crush of bodies, the weight of those around him could pin him in place. Panic set in quickly. Breathing became hard. If he cried out, it was often drowned in the cacophony of battle. Some soldiers died not from wounds, but from suffocation beneath the feet of their own comrades. And yet, despite the danger, more men continued to push forward, driven by momentum, fear, or orders shouted from behind. Behind the front ranks, soldiers waited their turn. They tried to push forward when they could, filling the gaps left by fallen comrades. These second and third lines were both support and reserve, reinforcing the fight and keeping pressure on the enemy. In theory, discipline kept the lines from breaking. In reality, once the fighting began, formations tended to dissolve rapidly. The chaos of battle meant that lines curved, shifted, and sometimes collapsed entirely. Units became intermingled. Commanders lost sight of their own men. Flags and banners, used as reference points, were obscured by dust or pulled down. Confusion spread like wildfire, and soldiers often found themselves fighting side by side with men they didn't recognize, against opponents who looked frighteningly similar to their own. Amid all this, commanders did their best to maintain order. They shouted commands, signaled with flags, or rode back and forth trying to encourage their troops. Mounted officers stood out in the chaos, and this made them prime targets. An officer with a colorful surcoat or a distinctive helmet might be singled out by enemy archers or footmen. Some wore plainer armor in hopes of avoiding attention, while others relished the chance to be seen and remembered. Either way, leading from the front was dangerous business, and many high-ranking men fell early in battle due to the visibility of their position. Archers played a critical role during the early and middle stages of battle. Positioned behind the infantry or on the flanks, they launched volleys of arrows into the enemy ranks, hoping to weaken their lines before or during the clash. The effectiveness of archers depended on many factors: the quality of their bows, the type of arrows used, the distance to the target, and of course, the weather. Rain could loosen bowstrings. Wind could deflect shots. Sunlight could blind the archers themselves or illuminate their targets. Arrows caused panic and confusion more than they inflicted mass casualties, though a well-placed volley could break a charging line or disrupt a key unit. Some archers fired in arcs, launching arrows high into the air to rain down unpredictably. Others aimed directly, seeking gaps in armor or exposed faces. Quivers emptied quickly, and once out of arrows, many archers joined the fray as light infantry, carrying daggers or small swords into the melee. Cavalry were often held back until the infantry engagement was well underway. Knights and mounted soldiers were expensive assets, and commanders were reluctant to commit them until the situation required it. A cavalry charge was a powerful weapon, but only if used at the right moment. Charging too early could mean slamming into fresh, well-organized infantry lines, a disaster for the horses and riders alike. Waiting too long, on the other hand, could mean missing the opportunity to break the enemy's momentum or exploit a weakness. When a cavalry charge was finally ordered, it was a dramatic moment, not just for the spectacle, but for its potential to change the course of the battle. The sound of a charge, the thunder of hooves, the jingle of harnesses, the shouted commands, sent a ripple of tension through the ranks. Horses, armored and powerful, moved in coordinated lines, lowering their lances as they picked up speed. But even this display of might was subject to the realities of the battlefield. Horses could stumble, especially on muddy or uneven ground. Arrows might pick off a few riders before they reached their target. Gaps in the formation could cause disarray. And once the charge hit home, it rarely resulted in a clean breakthrough. Instead, the cavalry often found themselves bogged down in the same melee as the infantry, their mounts unable to move freely, their lances broken or discarded, and their swords drawn for close combat. For those caught in the melee, infantry, cavalry, archers alike, the fight became a matter of endurance. There was little time for strategy or reflection. Every moment was filled with instinctual action: parry, strike, step, shove, brace. Heat became unbearable under armor. Sweat stung the eyes. Hands cramped from gripping weapons too tightly. Shields splintered. Helmets shifted out of place. Breathing was difficult, and the noise was relentless. Communication was almost impossible. Even nearby allies could not be heard over the din. Orders from commanders were often lost or ignored. Each soldier was alone in a crowd, acting on instinct and trying to stay upright. Despite all this, most medieval battles were surprisingly short. The actual fighting, from first clash to final retreat, often lasted less than 2 hours. Some engagements were over in under 30 minutes. Once one side began to lose cohesion, when lines broke, panic spread, or a commander fell, the rest often followed quickly. Fear was contagious. When men saw others running, they ran too. When they saw their banner fall, they assumed defeat. When they lost contact with their officers, they chose survival over orders. And so the clash that began in slow motion, full of uncertainty and hesitation, often ended with a sudden collapse. What remained was not triumph, but silence. The battlefield, once alive with noise and motion, became eerily still. Soldiers stood breathing heavily, weapons hanging at their sides, unsure of what came next. Victory, if it came, felt more like relief than joy. Defeat, if it happened, was a mixture of confusion, regret, and disbelief. The clash itself, brutal, brief, and bewildering, faded quickly into memory, and the survivors were left with only the aftermath. When the fighting finally ended, whether after 30 minutes or 2 long hours, the battlefield did not return to peace immediately. Instead, it shifted into a different kind of chaos, quieter, but no less grim. The adrenaline that had powered every soldier began to fade, and in its place came the slow realization of just how much had been endured, how many friends were missing, and how little glory there was to be found in the dirt and dust. What came next, after the shouting had ceased and the banners were lowered, was not a neat conclusion or an orderly retreat, but an extended, exhausting ordeal marked by confusion, weariness, and the heavy labor of survival. This was the true conclusion of a medieval battle, not a victory parade, but the long, often muddy, always uncomfortable process of dealing with what remained. For those who had survived the clash, the first moments of calm were anything but peaceful. Soldiers stood panting in the open, their arms trembling from exertion, their hands still tightly gripping weapons even though there was no longer anyone to strike. Many were disoriented, their ears ringing from the noise of the battle. Some had wounds they had not even noticed until they tried to move. Bruises, cuts, broken fingers, cracked ribs, injuries both large and small began to register now that the immediate danger had passed. Armor was dented, straps torn, shields split. Helmets were askew or missing entirely, discarded in the heat of combat. Faces were streaked with mud, sweat, and occasionally blood. Breathing came in heavy gasps, not from fear now, but from the sheer physical effort it had taken to stay alive. The battlefield itself was unrecognizable from what it had been only hours before. Where once there had been orderly formations, lines of spears, and disciplined archers, there was now a churned mess of earth, broken equipment, and scattered debris. The ground was littered with lost helmets, snapped arrows, shattered shields, and bent swords. Horses, if they had been involved, left deep tracks in the mud. Bodies lay sprawled at odd angles, some face down in the grass, others curled on their sides, their final moments frozen in place. Not all of them were gone. Some groaned softly, others cried out for help. Many were too weak to move or even speak, and lay unnoticed among the fallen, waiting for assistance that might not come. In these moments, the first real test of leadership began. Commanders who had managed to survive had to quickly regain control of their men, assess the situation, and determine whether a pursuit was needed, a retreat was imminent, or a regrouping was possible. Shouting resumed, not of battle cries, but of roll calls. Officers barked the names of their soldiers, trying to determine who had survived, who had fled, and who might be somewhere in between. The challenge was immense. Units were scattered. Many soldiers had lost their groups entirely and wandered dazed across the field, looking for familiar faces or banners. Identification was difficult. In the heat of battle, surcoats were torn, colors were muddied, and emblems were obscured. Mistaken identities were common, and tensions remained high even after the fighting had stopped. For those tasked with medical care, usually a handful of clergy, camp followers, or older soldiers, the work began immediately. They moved slowly across the field, stepping carefully among the wounded, searching for those who could still be helped. Their tools were crude, their knowledge limited, but their role was vital. Wounds were cleaned with whatever water was available, bandages were applied using torn strips of clothing or sackcloth, and splints were fashioned from broken spear shafts or tent poles. There were no anesthetics beyond wine or strong drink, and surgeries were performed only when absolutely necessary. Amputations were rare but not unheard of, especially if a limb was badly crushed or infected. Most treatment focused on stopping bleeding, removing arrows or splinters, and preventing immediate death. Long-term survival was a matter of luck and resilience. Among the most sobering tasks was the counting and collection of the fallen. This grim work was assigned to the least fortunate, or the least senior members of the army. Using carts, sledges, or simply their own backs, soldiers dragged bodies into rows for identification. Those of noble birth were given priority. Their armor was valuable, and their status made their recovery important for political reasons. Some were stripped of their gear by their own comrades, who believed the dead no longer needed protection or property. Others were robbed by scavengers who followed armies for this very purpose. The battlefield, for all its horror, was a source of wealth to those willing to pick through it. Weapons, jewelry, coin purses, and even boots were taken. In some cases, the enemy was responsible for this scavenging. If the victors remained on the field, they often looted the fallen before turning their attention to the wounded. Retreating soldiers faced their own set of challenges. If a side had lost the battle, their scattered remnants were forced to find each other in unfamiliar terrain, without clear leadership or supplies. Many had dropped their weapons to run faster. Some had removed pieces of armor to escape more easily. Now, exposed and defenseless, they moved in small groups, hoping to avoid pursuit. The fear of capture was real. Ransoming was common among noble opponents, but common soldiers could not expect such mercy. They might be pressed into service, imprisoned, or worse. As a result, many retreating soldiers avoided roads or known trails, moving instead through forests, hills, or marshes. Hunger and thirst quickly became problems. Injuries slowed progress. Morale was nearly non-existent. What had been an army in the morning was, by evening, little more than a collection of frightened individuals trying to survive. Back at the camp, those who had stayed behind, cooks, armorers, blacksmiths, messengers, waited nervously for news. The outcome of the battle might not be known for hours, even if it had happened nearby. Rumors arrived first, carried by wounded men or fleeing soldiers. Some claimed victory prematurely, while others brought tales of total disaster. The camp could erupt into panic or celebration based on incomplete information. Fires were built to provide light, though they also made the camp visible to any nearby enemies. Guards were posted, and defenses were strengthened, just in case. Medical tents, if any existed, filled quickly. Supplies were stretched thin. Clean water was in high demand, and food stores were suddenly more valuable than ever. The entire camp shifted into recovery mode, uncertain of what the next day would bring. Commanders faced difficult decisions in the aftermath. If they had won the battle, they needed to secure the area, prevent looting, and prepare for a possible counterattack. If they had lost, they had to determine whether retreat was possible, where their forces had gone, and how many could be regrouped. Messages were sent to nearby towns or castles, requesting reinforcements, supplies, or sanctuary. Diplomats might be dispatched to negotiate terms with the enemy. In some cases, prisoners were exchanged, or a temporary truce was called to allow both sides to collect their dead. The political consequences of a battle were often as significant as the military ones. A minor defeat could lead to the loss of territory, the weakening of alliances, or even the collapse of a noble family's claim to power. For the average soldier, however, these high-level concerns were far removed from their immediate experience. Most cared little for strategy or diplomacy. They were focused on survival, finding food, tending wounds, and reconnecting with their companions. In the days following a battle, the mood among the survivors was subdued. Even in victory, there was little rejoicing. The physical toll was immense, and the emotional toll even greater. Friends had been lost. Sleep was hard to come by. The sounds of battle echoed in their minds long after the real noise had faded. Some turned to prayer, others to drink, and many to silence. They did not speak of what they had seen, not out of modesty, but because the memories were still too raw. Rebuilding an army after a battle was no simple task. Weapons had to be repaired or replaced. Horses had to be rounded up, fed, and treated for injuries. Armor needed mending. Morale needed lifting. New recruits might be called in, or surviving veterans reassigned to bolster weakened units. Training resumed, though half-heartedly. The next battle, if it came, loomed on the horizon like a cloud, distant but inevitable. No one was eager for it, but everyone understood that it was part of the cycle. March, wait, fight, recover. This was the rhythm of medieval warfare, and it offered little room for rest. And so, the aftermath of a medieval battle was not a clean ending but a slow transition into the next stage of hardship. There were no cheering crowds, no polished speeches, no gleaming trophies. There was only the long walk back, to camp, to the next town, to the next conflict. The survivors carried with them not just the scars of battle, but the weight of what they had seen, done, and lost. The battlefield itself would remain scarred for days or weeks. Birds would circle overhead. Farmers would avoid the area. Rain would eventually wash away the blood, and grass would grow again. But for those who had fought there, the memory would linger far longer than the marks on the land. This, more than anything else, was what really happened after a medieval battle. It was not the stuff of songs or stories, but of silence, soreness, and survival. And it was far from over. The war, after all, had not ended. This was just one battle in a series of many, and the road to the next was already beginning. The distant sound of clinking armor mixed with the steady crunch of boots on dirt roads as dawn broke quietly over the countryside. For many soldiers, the journey to the battlefield was the beginning of the ordeal, long before any sword was drawn or shield raised. The march was slow and exhausting, often covering miles of rough terrain under the weight of heavy gear and the watchful eyes of commanders eager to maintain order. Roads were crowded with lines of men, horses, and wagons carrying supplies, weapons, and sometimes the sick or injured. Villages along the way held their breath as columns of soldiers passed through, faces tired and determined, hearts heavy with uncertainty. The call to arms came suddenly for many. Lords sent heralds riding at full speed, bearing letters sealed with wax, commanding their vassals and peasants alike to gather weapons and prepare to fight. Obedience was not optional. Loyalty to one's lord was tied to survival and honor. A man who refused to answer the call risked punishment or loss of status, and often a lifetime of shame. Families hurried to equip their sons, husbands, and brothers with whatever armor or weapons they could find or afford. Knights polished their chain mail and checked their horses, while common foot soldiers strapped on rough leather or padded cloth for protection. The march was the first test of endurance, a physical and mental challenge that many underestimated. On the road, soldiers learned the true meaning of fatigue. The combination of uneven paths, weather conditions, and the weight of armor made every step a small battle. Feet blistered inside thick boots or sometimes bare leather sandals. Rain turned roads into sticky mud that sucked at hooves and heels alike. The sun could beat down mercilessly, burning skin beneath helmets and turning breath shallow. At night, the army camped wherever they could find dry ground. Soldiers slept on cold earth, their bodies aching from hours of marching. Fires were lit in small circles for warmth and to cook meager meals. but the smoke had to be kept low to avoid attracting enemies or bandits lurking in nearby woods. Sleep was often interrupted by guards rotating watches or the cries of wounded men who could not rest. Despite these hardships, the march also forged bonds between men who might never have met otherwise. Class lines blurred as nobles rode alongside peasants, sharing stories and food when chance allowed. The camaraderie of shared struggle was a source of strength in uncertain times. Songs and chants were common, helping to keep spirits up and feet moving. Simple melodies recalled home, family, or heroic tales, though not everyone could carry a tune. Laughter, rare but treasured, broke the monotony of the journey. Even in the face of fear and exhaustion, these moments of connection reminded soldiers they were part of something larger than themselves. Supplies were always a concern. Medieval armies rarely brought enough food to sustain themselves for long campaigns. Soldiers often depended on foraging or purchasing what they could from villagers along the way. This sometimes caused tension, as crops were stripped bare and barns emptied. Commanders tried to balance speed and supply, knowing that a hungry army was a weak army. Water was vital, but clean sources were not always available. Contaminated wells could spread illness quickly, and many soldiers fell ill before ever reaching the battlefield. Disease was an invisible enemy, often deadlier than the opposing army. Dysentery, respiratory infections, and fevers spread in crowded camps, and medical knowledge was limited. Leadership on the march was both vital and difficult. Commanders relied on signals like flags, drums, and shouted orders to keep the army moving together. Horses carried messages between different parts of the column, but communication was often slow and unreliable. A single broken wagon wheel or a lost horse could cause delays that rippled through the ranks. Discipline was uneven, as some soldiers obeyed orders carefully while others took advantage of moments to rest or scavenge. Arguments broke out over food, water, or resting places. Yet, despite these challenges, the army moved forward, driven by duty, fear, or hope. As the army neared the battlefield, tension grew. Scouts returned with news of the enemy's position and strength, though details were often vague or exaggerated. Rumors spread among the men, some true, some false, about what awaited them. Stories of great victories, terrible losses, or strange tactics filled campfires and tents. Superstitions ran high. Soldiers looked for signs and omens, wondering if the stars or weather were favorable. Priests and monks prayed for protection, while others tried to steel themselves with silence. The march, though exhausting, was also a time of quiet preparation for the trial to come. By the time the soldiers reached the field where they would fight, many were already worn down. Their armor bore scratches and dents from travel. Their faces were streaked with dirt and sweat. Horses snorted and shifted uneasily, sensing the tension in the air. Commanders ordered final checks of weapons and gear, while men adjusted their helmets and shield straps. The peaceful countryside, once filled with birdsong and gentle breezes, now felt heavy and still, as if the land itself held its breath. For every soldier, the march had been a slow building of anticipation, exhaustion, and fear, the long walk to a moment that would change everything. In the days leading up to the clash on the battlefield, much attention was given to the armor and weapons each soldier carried. These pieces were more than just tools of war. They were symbols of status, sources of protection, and sometimes even a burden that weighed heavily on the men who wore and wielded them. Armor evolved over centuries, shaped by advances in metallurgy, tactics, and the demands of the battlefield itself. The equipment a soldier carried could mean the difference between life and death, but it also required great strength, endurance, and skill to use effectively. At the heart of any medieval warrior's kit was his armor. For knights and men of higher rank, armor was often made of interlocking rings called chain mail, a flexible mesh of metal links that covered the body from head to toe. Later, plates of steel began to be shaped and fitted together to protect vital areas without sacrificing too much mobility. Underneath the armor, soldiers wore padded garments called gambesons that cushioned blows and prevented chafing. The weight of a full suit of armor could range from 30 to 60 pounds or more, distributed across the body, but it still slowed a man's movements and made certain tasks more difficult. For common foot soldiers, armor was less elaborate and often consisted of leather or boiled hide reinforced with small metal plates or rings. Helmets were typically made from iron or steel and shaped to protect the head and face, though they were sometimes uncomfortable and limited vision or hearing. Shields were essential defensive tools for all ranks. Made from wood and covered in leather or metal, they varied in size and shape, from small round bucklers to large kite or tower shields that could cover a soldier's entire body. Shields could block arrows, parry sword strikes, and provide a barrier in the thick of battle. Weapons, like armor, came in many forms depending on a soldier's role and resources. The sword was the most iconic weapon of the medieval period, especially among knights. However, swords were expensive to produce and required training to use effectively. Foot soldiers often carried simpler, more practical weapons such as spears, pikes, axes, and maces. Spears and pikes were especially important in forming defensive lines against cavalry charges. Their long reach allowed soldiers to keep mounted opponents at a distance, presenting a wall of sharp points to any attacker. Axes and maces, designed to crush armor and bones, were favored for close combat and required less finesse than swords. The crossbow and longbow revolutionized medieval warfare by allowing soldiers to strike enemies from a distance. The crossbow was easier to learn and required less physical strength, making it popular among mercenaries and militia. It could fire bolts with deadly accuracy and power, capable of penetrating armor at medium range. The longbow, used famously by English archers, demanded considerable strength and skill but could unleash rapid volleys of arrows that devastated opposing forces. Archers were crucial for softening enemy lines before the melee began, but they also faced great risks if enemy cavalry or infantry broke through their defenses. Despite the protection armor offered, it was far from perfect. Armor could be cumbersome and hot, especially under the midday sun. It limited a soldier's ability to run, climb, or move quickly, making endurance and positioning vital. Gaps in armor, such as the joints, armpits, and visor openings, were vulnerable spots that skilled opponents aimed for. Blows from heavy weapons like war hammers or maces could cause concussions or internal injuries even if the armor was not pierced. Over time, designs evolved to cover more areas and distribute weight better, but the fundamental trade-off between protection and mobility remained. Training with weapons and armor was essential. Knights spent years learning how to ride, wield swords, and fight in formation. Foot soldiers trained with their spears and shields, practiced archery, or learned to coordinate with their comrades. Without training, the heavy armor and complex weapons could become liabilities. Soldiers needed strength, coordination, and endurance to fight effectively for even a few minutes under such demanding conditions. The maintenance of armor and weapons was a constant task. After battles or marches, soldiers cleaned and repaired their gear. Rust was a persistent enemy, as metal exposed to moisture could quickly degrade. Blacksmiths and armorers traveled with armies or operated near camps to fix broken swords, replace lost parts of armor, and sharpen blades. A soldier with damaged or ill-fitting equipment was at great risk during combat, as even a small failure could mean serious injury or death. Beyond practical concerns, armor and weapons also carried symbolic meaning. They represented a warrior's status, loyalty, and courage. Knights displayed their family crests and colors on shields and surcoats, announcing their identity and heritage. The shining of polished armor was meant to impress allies and intimidate foes. The sword was a knight's most treasured possession, often gifted in ceremonies or passed down through generations. Even among common soldiers, weapons were prized possessions, sometimes crafted by local smiths or customized to fit personal needs. In battle, the effectiveness of armor and weapons was tested under brutal conditions. Clashes were loud, chaotic, and violent. Armor could deflect blows but could not guarantee safety. Weapons were swung, thrust, and thrown with desperation and skill. The sights, sounds, and smells of combat were intense: the ringing of steel, the cries of pain, the scent of sweat and earth. For many soldiers, the battle was less about heroics and more about survival, relying on the protection their gear offered and their own ability to stay upright and fight back. Despite the advances in technology and craftsmanship, the medieval battlefield remained a place of uncertainty. Armor might save a man's life one moment and trap him helpless the next. A weapon could pierce an enemy's defenses or be broken in a single strike. The outcome depended on many factors beyond equipment: luck, strategy, morale, and sheer willpower. Still, the armor and weapons carried by medieval soldiers were indispensable tools, the difference between hope and despair in the chaos of war. In medieval warfare, horses were much more than mere animals. They were powerful partners in battle and symbols of status, skill, and might. The cavalry, soldiers mounted on horseback, played a unique and critical role that could tip the balance of a battle in an instant. Understanding the importance of horses and the men who rode them is essential to grasping what really happened on medieval battlefields. The relationship between rider and horse required trust, training, and coordination, and the impact of cavalry charges was both tactical and psychological. Horses used in battle were specially bred and trained for the demands of warfare. Unlike the sleek horses used for racing, war horses were strong and sturdy, capable of carrying the heavy armor of knights and their riders. These animals were often called destriers, though other types of horses were also used depending on region and availability. Training began early, teaching horses to remain calm amid the noise of battle, to respond to the rider's commands quickly, and to maneuver through dense formations of soldiers and obstacles. A panicked horse could cause chaos, trampling friend and foe alike, so control was paramount. Mounted knights were the elite warriors of their time, distinguished by their armor, weapons, and horsemanship. Riding a horse into battle gave a significant height advantage, allowing them to see over the crowds and strike down at enemies with lances, swords, or maces. The speed and momentum of a cavalry charge could break infantry lines, scatter archers, and demoralize opposing troops. The shock of horses thundering toward an enemy was often enough to cause panic and disorder before a single blow was struck. However, deploying cavalry effectively required skill and timing. A charge launched too early could be stopped by well-prepared foot soldiers equipped with pikes or spears. Charging into rough terrain or muddy fields could bog down horses and riders, making them easy targets. Commanders had to carefully coordinate cavalry attacks with infantry movements and archery volleys. Cavalry also served in reconnaissance roles, scouting enemy positions and harassing supply lines. Their mobility allowed for quick strikes and rapid retreats, providing flexibility on the battlefield. Despite their advantages, cavalry had vulnerabilities. Horses were large targets and could be injured or killed by arrows, spears, or other weapons. Losing a horse in battle could be disastrous for a knight, leaving him vulnerable and often isolated. Knights themselves faced danger from foot soldiers wielding polearms designed to unseat riders or pierce armor. The weight of armor, while protective, could hinder a rider's ability to dismount quickly or fight effectively on foot if necessary. Horses required significant care and resources. Feeding and maintaining a stable of warhorses demanded supplies of hay, grain, and clean water. Veterinary knowledge was limited, so injured or sick horses often had to be replaced. Horses also needed rest and exercise to stay fit, which could complicate long campaigns and marches. The loss of horses in battle or during marches could severely impact an army's effectiveness, reducing its speed and shock capability. The bond between knight and horse was more than practical. It was often emotional. Many knights formed close attachments to their mounts, which were sometimes named and treated with great care. Stories and songs celebrated the bravery of horses alongside their riders. A well-trained horse was a prized possession and could be worth as much as a fine suit of armor or a sword. Horses were sometimes armored themselves, with metal plates protecting their heads and bodies, adding weight but also extra defense. Cavalry tactics evolved over time, influenced by technology, terrain, and enemy strategies. In some battles, cavalry fought in tight formations, charging in waves to maximize impact. In others, they operated in smaller, more mobile units, focusing on skirmishing and disruption. Heavy cavalry, like knights in full armor, specialized in powerful charges, while lighter cavalry units used speed and agility for scouting and hit-and-run attacks. Different regions had their own styles. For example, Eastern horse archers used bows from horseback to devastating effect, while Western knights emphasized shock and close combat. The presence of cavalry on the battlefield also had psychological effects. The sight and sound of charging horses could intimidate infantry, lowering their morale. Conversely, a well-timed cavalry charge could rally a faltering army, inspiring soldiers to fight harder. Commanders carefully managed these moments, using cavalry as both a physical and emotional weapon. However, overconfidence or poor timing could turn cavalry charges into disasters, with riders isolated and cut down by prepared enemies. In sum, horses and cavalry were vital elements of medieval warfare, combining strength, speed, and strategy. Their effectiveness depended not only on the skill of the riders but also on the condition and training of the horses themselves. Far from simply riding into battle, cavalrymen had to master horsemanship, tactics, and cooperation with other arms of the army. The thunderous charge of cavalry remains one of the most enduring images of medieval battle, but behind that dramatic moment lay a complex world of preparation, care, and calculated risk. One of the most crucial aspects of medieval battles was how armies organized themselves into formations and used tactics to gain advantage over their opponents. Fighting wasn't a random chaotic free-for-all. Rather, it involved careful planning, discipline, and coordination. The way soldiers stood and moved could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Although the actual fighting might seem confusing to an outsider, medieval commanders put great effort into arranging their men into effective groups designed to protect, attack, and control the battlefield. The most common formation for infantry was the shield wall. This was a tight line of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, each holding a shield that overlapped with his neighbor's. The wall acted as a solid barrier against arrows, spears, and sword strikes. Soldiers in the front row bore the brunt of the enemy's attack, while those behind could thrust their spears or swing their weapons over the shoulders of the men in front. The shield wall required discipline, as soldiers had to maintain their position without breaking ranks even under pressure. If the line faltered or gaps appeared, the enemy could exploit these openings to break through and cause panic. Another popular formation was the schiltron, used especially by Scottish forces. This was a dense circle or square of spearmen pointing their long weapons outward in all directions, creating a defensive hedgehog that was difficult for cavalry to penetrate. Schiltrons were effective at repelling charges but less mobile than other formations. Holding the shape under attack required steady nerves and strong coordination among the soldiers. The schiltron showed how different tactics could be adapted to the strengths and weaknesses of available troops and terrain. Cavalry formations were different, designed to maximize speed and impact. Knights often gathered in groups called lances or troops, riding together to launch powerful charges. They might form wedge-shaped formations, pointing forward like an arrowhead to concentrate force on a narrow point in the enemy line. Sometimes cavalry attacked in flanking maneuvers, aiming to hit the enemy from the sides or rear where defenses were weaker. These tactics demanded timing and communication, as a failed charge could leave riders isolated and vulnerable. Commanders used signals to control movements on the battlefield. Without radios or modern communication, messages were sent by flag waving, trumpet blasts, drum beats, or shouted commands. These signals indicated when to advance, retreat, or change formation. Soldiers needed to be trained to recognize and respond quickly to these cues. Misinterpretations could lead to confusion or disaster, such as charging too early or breaking ranks prematurely. Tactics also depended heavily on the terrain. Open fields were ideal for cavalry charges and large formations, while forests, hills, or marshes limited movement and favored ambushes or guerrilla-style fighting. Commanders studied the land carefully, choosing where to fight to maximize their advantages. They might position archers on higher ground to rain arrows down on the enemy, or hide infantry in woods to surprise attackers. Control of key points like bridges, roads, and hills often determined the outcome of battles. Deception played a role in medieval tactics as well. Armies used feints, or false attacks, to lure enemies out of position. They might light campfires in several places to confuse scouts or march in circles to hide their true intentions. Ambushes were common, with soldiers lying in wait to strike when the enemy was vulnerable or distracted. These tricks required discipline and secrecy, and could turn the tide of a battle without a single blow being struck in the main fight. The use of reserves was another important tactical element. Commanders often kept a portion of their forces back from the front lines, ready to reinforce weak points or exploit opportunities. These reserves could be fresh soldiers who had not yet fought, or specialized troops like archers or heavy cavalry. Knowing when and where to deploy reserves was a test of leadership and judgment that could decide victory or defeat. Despite all planning, medieval battles were unpredictable. Mistakes, fatigue, and sheer chance affected outcomes. Soldiers could become disoriented in the smoke and noise, orders might not reach all units, and individual bravery or panic could change the flow of combat. The best commanders prepared for these uncertainties by building flexible formations and encouraging initiative among their subordinates. In summary, the formations and tactics of medieval armies reflected a careful balance between protection, offense, and adaptability. Soldiers learned to fight as part of a group, trusting their neighbors and leaders to hold the line and press the attack. These strategies allowed medieval armies to achieve victories against often overwhelming odds and shaped the brutal but fascinating nature of warfare in that era. Behind the frontline foot soldiers and cavalry, archers and siege weapons played a crucial role in shaping medieval battles. Though often less visible than the clashing swords or charging horses, their impact could be decisive. Archers, armed with longbows or crossbows, launched deadly volleys of arrows to disrupt enemy formations, break shields, and cause fear before the melee even began. Siege weapons like trebuchets and catapults hurled massive stones or fiery projectiles over walls or into tightly packed troops, wreaking havoc from a distance. Understanding how these weapons were used reveals much about the strategy and technology that defined medieval warfare. Archers were typically positioned at the flanks or behind the main battle lines. Their role was to weaken enemy forces by firing arrows in coordinated volleys. The longbow, especially famous among English forces, required great skill and strength to use effectively. Skilled archers could release arrows rapidly, sometimes shooting as many as 10 or more per minute, creating a rain of deadly projectiles that pierced armor and caused panic. Crossbows, by contrast, were easier to use but slower to reload. They delivered powerful shots capable of penetrating heavier armor at shorter ranges. Together, these weapons helped shape the battlefield before the soldiers ever clashed. Training was essential for archers. Longbowmen began practicing from a young age to develop the strength needed to draw powerful bows accurately. They learned to judge distances, aim for weak spots in armor, and coordinate their shots with signals from commanders. Crossbowmen, often mercenaries or specialized troops, focused on accuracy and patience, waiting for the right moment to release their bolts. Both types of archers faced great danger. While firing from behind the lines offered some protection, enemy cavalry or infantry could break through and attack them. Archers were lightly armored and relied on distance and positioning to survive. Siege weapons, on the other hand, were large, mechanical devices designed to attack fortifications or mass troops from afar. Trebuchets were among the most powerful, using counterweights to launch huge stones with great force and accuracy. Catapults worked similarly but on a smaller scale. Ballistas resembled giant crossbows, firing large bolts or spears. These machines could destroy walls, gates, and towers, or scatter tightly packed enemy soldiers. Building and operating siege weapons required skilled engineers and craftsmen, and transporting them to the battlefield was a major logistical challenge. While siege weapons were mostly associated with attacking castles or fortified towns, they were sometimes used on open battlefields. Their presence could force enemy commanders to alter tactics or avoid certain areas. The noise, smoke, and destruction caused by these machines had psychological effects as well, frightening horses and lowering enemy morale. Defenders often responded by building stronger walls, digging ditches, or developing countermeasures like fire pots or ballistae of their own. The coordination between archers, siege weapons, and frontline troops was vital. Archers would soften enemy lines with volleys before the infantry advanced, while siege weapons could target enemy leaders or dense formations. Timing was everything. A well-executed barrage could break enemy spirit and formation, making the final charge easier and less costly. Conversely, if archers ran out of arrows or siege weapons were destroyed or captured, the attacking force might lose a key advantage. Logistics played a critical role in the effectiveness of archers and siege weapons. Arrows had to be produced in large quantities, transported carefully, and stored to prevent damage. Siege weapons required materials like wood, iron, and rope, and skilled workers to maintain and repair them. Armies often brought specialized supply trains and engineers for this purpose. A shortage of arrows or failure of a siege machine could turn the tide of battle against the attackers. The use of these weapons also reflected broader technological and tactical changes in medieval warfare. As armor improved and cavalry tactics evolved, ranged weapons gained importance. Armies invested more in training archers and developing siege engines. The ability to strike from a distance became a strategic priority, changing how battles were planned and fought. This shift sometimes favored smaller or less wealthy armies that could field many archers rather than expensive knights. Despite their power, archers and siege weapons had limitations. Weather could affect their effectiveness. Rain or strong winds made aiming difficult, and wet conditions could damage bows or ropes. Siege weapons took time to set up and were vulnerable during construction. Enemy forces often targeted archers or engineers to disrupt these weapons. Also, while deadly, these weapons alone could not win a battle. They needed to be combined with strong infantry and cavalry forces to capitalize on the opportunities they created. In the end, archers and siege weapons were indispensable parts of medieval armies, adding layers of complexity and capability to warfare. Their presence on the battlefield shaped tactics, morale, and the outcomes of battles across Europe and beyond. Understanding their role helps us appreciate the full picture of medieval combat, a world where skill, technology, and courage came together in a dramatic dance of survival and strategy. When the sounds of battle faded and the fields emptied of soldiers, what lingered most were the invisible burdens each survivor carried with them. While some soldiers returned to their homes with bags of loot or tales of glory, most bore quieter, heavier things, memories of noise and fear, exhaustion in their bones, and the knowledge of what they had seen and done. This final chapter is not about strategies or victories, but about what came after, the deeply personal, often unspoken experience of carrying the battle home. For many foot soldiers, homecoming was not the triumphant return that ballads would later describe. Most had left their villages with only a small bundle of belongings, perhaps a spear or padded jacket, and returned with even less. Their shoes might be falling apart, their cloaks ripped, their coin purses empty or filled with unfamiliar currencies from distant towns. Some had acquired armor or weapons scavenged from the battlefield, crude trophies that would either be sold or displayed as proof of survival. A dented helmet with a cracked visor could become a household item, hung near the hearth not as a symbol of pride, but as a quiet reminder of what had been endured. Others brought home physical wounds that never fully healed. A deep cut on the leg might fester, a shattered bone might never set correctly, or an eye might be lost to a glancing arrow. Without proper medical care, these injuries became lifelong burdens. They affected a man's ability to work, to farm, to carry loads, or to protect his family. Scars were common, and while some wore them as marks of bravery, others covered them to avoid the questions they provoked. Even those who seemed whole on the outside often felt different inside. The psychological weight was perhaps the heaviest. Soldiers had experienced things far outside the rhythm of everyday medieval life. They had watched comrades fall beside them, heard the cries of the wounded echo across the field, and seen the sun rise on landscapes littered with the fallen. These images did not vanish once the battle ended. For some, sleep became troubled. Nightmares would revisit scenes of confusion and terror. Others grew quieter, their gaze drifting far when they sat near the fire, their minds returning to places they could not describe. There were no words in the common tongue for what we might now call trauma, but it was felt all the same. In towns and villages, returning soldiers were both welcomed and kept at a slight distance. Celebrations were held, especially if the war had been won or the local lord had returned with honor. Ale flowed, bells rang, and stories were told late into the night. Yet beneath the laughter was an undercurrent of unease. Those who had stayed behind, the women, children, elders, could not fully understand what had occurred out there. And those who had fought sometimes found it hard to explain. Some soldiers tried to make light of it, exaggerating their tales for humor or applause. Others refused to speak of it at all, their silence louder than any boast. Religion played a role in helping survivors cope. Churches held services to give thanks for victory and to pray for the souls of the dead. Soldiers made offerings, lit candles, and confessed to sins committed in the fog of war. Some took pilgrimages to distant shrines, hoping to find forgiveness or peace. Others joined religious orders, seeking a life of reflection after the violence they had witnessed. The connection between battle and faith was strong in the medieval mind. A soldier might believe he had survived because of divine intervention, or that he was being punished for a lack of faith. The church offered comfort, but also reminded people of the spiritual cost of war. Family life, too, was changed. A father might return to children who had grown while he was gone. A husband might come back to a wife who had managed the household in his absence, now more independent than before. These reunions were not always easy. War changed people, and not everyone returned the same. Some relationships grew stronger through shared gratitude. Others were strained by the gap between experience and expectation. In some cases, the returning soldier felt alien in his own home, unable to settle back into the routines he had once known so well. Communities had to rebuild after battles. Roads needed repair, fields replanting, and livestock restocking. If the battle had occurred nearby, the land itself might be scarred. Farmers would find arrowheads in the soil, or bones long after the armies had moved on. Children played in places where soldiers had once fought, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Over time, nature softened the marks of war, but the people remembered. Songs were written, names added to church walls, and anniversaries kept. The memory of battle became part of the local identity. Not all stories ended at home. Some soldiers never returned. Their names were spoken with a pause, a glance toward the road, a candle left burning just a little longer than usual. Others chose not to come back. They joined mercenary bands, seeking gold and adventure elsewhere, or wandered from town to town, unable to settle. A few took up work as guards or soldiers for hire, turning their skills into a trade. For these men, the battlefield was not a single chapter, but the beginning of a life shaped by war. Artifacts from battles made their way into daily life. A sword might be passed down as an heirloom, its edge dull but its story sharp. A helmet might be repurposed as a cooking pot or a bucket. A tattered banner could line a chest or be cut into patches for clothing. These remnants were not just souvenirs, but part of a new, quieter life. They carried memories that words could not always capture. Ultimately, what soldiers carried home was more than physical. It was the weight of memory, of changed perspective, of knowing what others did not. Some found strength in that knowledge, others sorrow. The battlefield never truly left them, no matter how far they traveled or how many years passed. It lived in their silences, their stories, and the way they looked at the world. In this way, medieval battles left their deepest marks not in the soil, but in the people. In the hands that held tools instead of swords, in the eyes that scanned the horizon a little more cautiously, in the hearts that beat a little heavier when church bells rang in memory. The story did not end when the fighting stopped. It continued in every home where a soldier returned, and in every moment where the past quietly reached into the present. The moment a medieval battle began, order often gave way to chaos. What commanders planned with careful precision was quickly challenged by the fog of war, a term that describes the confusion, noise, and uncertainty that soldiers faced on the battlefield. The clash of weapons, shouts of men, and thunder of hooves created a whirlwind of sensory overload. For every soldier, understanding what was happening around them was difficult, and fear was never far away. Despite this, the courage and discipline of many held the army together amid the disorder. As armies met, the noise was overwhelming. The clash of swords ringing against armor, the thud of arrows striking shields or flesh, the pounding of horses' hooves, and the cries of pain and command created a storm of sound. Visibility was often poor due to dust kicked up by hundreds or thousands of feet, smoke from fires or weapons, and the pressing bodies of soldiers. In the confusion, soldiers might lose sight of friends and foes alike, making it hard to tell who was where or what was happening at the front lines. Fear was a constant companion. Soldiers knew they faced deadly weapons and that any mistake could be fatal. The presence of wounded or fallen comrades heightened anxiety, as did the uncertainty of the battle's outcome. Many experienced a surge of adrenaline mixed with terror. Some fought fiercely to protect themselves and those beside them, while others panicked and tried to flee. Panic was contagious. A small break in the line could quickly turn into a rout as soldiers ran in disorder, sometimes abandoning armor and weapons to save their lives. Despite this, training and discipline helped many soldiers stay focused. Commands shouted by officers or signaled by banners helped guide troops, though communication was far from perfect. Soldiers relied heavily on their unit cohesion, the bond with those standing next to them, to hold their position. Close formations like shield walls helped maintain order by physically linking men together. The sense of duty, loyalty to leaders, and fear of shame also motivated soldiers to stand firm in terrifying circumstances. Individual acts of bravery stood out amid the chaos. Some soldiers charged through enemy lines, rallied fallen comrades, or held critical positions despite overwhelming odds. Such acts could inspire others and change the battle's momentum. Knights, trained from youth to fight on horseback and in hand-to-hand combat, often played key roles by breaking enemy ranks or protecting weaker troops. Foot soldiers, too, proved vital through sheer endurance and determination. The terrain and weather added to the confusion. Muddy fields made footing slippery, causing men and horses to stumble or fall. Hills and forests could block lines of sight and separate units. Rain or fog reduced visibility further. Commanders had to adapt their plans quickly as these factors changed conditions on the ground. Soldiers learned to use the landscape to their advantage, seeking higher ground or shelter. Injuries and death were frequent and brutal. The sight of blood and the sounds of suffering were harsh realities for soldiers and onlookers. Medical knowledge was limited, so many wounds became infected or fatal. Those who fell were often left on the field during the battle, unable to be helped until fighting subsided. This grim aspect of war weighed heavily on many men and shaped their experiences profoundly. Despite the violence, medieval battles followed unwritten rules of conduct. Chivalry and honor played a role, especially among knights. Some fought with respect for their opponents, sparing captured enemies and treating nobles differently than common soldiers. However, the chaos often made such ideals difficult to maintain. Looting, cruelty, and harsh reprisals occurred, especially after a victory. In summary, the chaos and confusion of battle challenged every soldier's courage and skill. The noise, fear, and disorder tested the strength of armies and the resolve of individuals. Yet through training, leadership, and sheer willpower, many endured the storm and fought on. This complex and human side of medieval warfare reminds us that behind the legends and strategies were real people facing extraordinary challenges. In the midst of the noise and chaos of a medieval battle, leadership was critical to survival and success. Commanders, whether kings, lords, or experienced captains, carried the heavy responsibility of guiding thousands of men through confusion, fear, and danger. Their decisions shaped the course of battle, inspiring courage, coordinating tactics, and responding quickly to changing circumstances. The quality of leadership could mean the difference between victory and defeat, and even the fate of kingdoms. Medieval commanders faced enormous challenges. Communication across the battlefield was slow and difficult. Without modern technology, orders had to be conveyed by mounted messengers, signals, or shouted commands. Smoke, dust, and noise often made it impossible for soldiers to hear or see their leaders. Commanders relied on trusted subordinates to relay orders and maintain discipline among the ranks. Delegation and clear hierarchies were essential to effective control. The preparation for battle involved careful planning. Commanders studied maps, gathered intelligence on enemy forces, and devised strategies based on terrain, troop strengths, and weaknesses. They decided how to arrange infantry, cavalry, and archers, choosing formations and timing attacks to maximize advantage. Flexibility was important, as battles rarely went exactly as planned. Leaders had to adjust tactics on the fly and seize opportunities or respond to setbacks. Personal courage and example played a powerful role in leadership. Commanders often led from the front, riding among their troops to inspire confidence and rally them in difficult moments. Their presence could lift morale and steady nerves when the fight grew fierce. Conversely, if a leader fled or was captured, it could cause panic and collapse in their own ranks. Stories of heroic commanders became legends, passed down as examples of valor and wisdom. Leadership also required managing logistics and morale. Armies needed supplies of food, water, and equipment to sustain long campaigns. Keeping soldiers fed, rested, and motivated was a constant concern. Commanders used rewards, promises of land or riches, and appeals to honor and duty to maintain loyalty. They also disciplined those who disobeyed orders or threatened unity. Maintaining cohesion was vital when facing an enemy determined to break the line. The influence of knights and nobles in leadership was significant. Many commanders came from noble families, trained from youth in the arts of war. They brought experience, resources, and social authority. However, leadership was not limited to nobles. Skilled captains and experienced soldiers could rise through merit. The ability to inspire and manage troops mattered as much as birthright. Battles sometimes saw rival commanders face off, each trying to outthink and outfight the other. The risks to commanders were high. They were prime targets for enemy archers and assassins, as removing a leader could disrupt the entire army. Many commanders died or were captured in battle, changing the course of conflicts. Despite the dangers, effective leadership was a cornerstone of medieval warfare. Commanders who combined strategy, courage, and management helped their forces prevail against overwhelming odds. In conclusion, leadership on the medieval battlefield was a complex and demanding role. Commanders shaped every aspect of battle, from planning to execution, and bore the heavy burden of their soldiers' lives and futures. Their decisions and actions left lasting marks on history, proving that even in the chaos of war, human will and guidance were decisive forces. In every medieval battle, there came moments of sudden change, turning points where the tide shifted unexpectedly, altering the course of the fight and often determining the outcome. These moments could arise from brilliant tactics, acts of bravery, accidents, or simply luck. Understanding how such critical events unfolded helps us appreciate the fragile and unpredictable nature of warfare during this era. One common turning point was the successful charge or counterattack by cavalry. When knights or horsemen broke through enemy lines, they created chaos and panic among foot soldiers who were vulnerable to sudden flanking or rear attacks. The impact of a cavalry charge depended on timing and coordination. A well-timed charge could rout entire sections of an army, but a premature or poorly supported one could lead to disaster for the riders. Commanders watched carefully for these opportunities, knowing that seizing the moment was crucial. Another frequent turning point was the collapse or breach of defensive formations. Shield walls and spear formations provided protection and strength, but if broken or outflanked, they left soldiers exposed. Enemy forces would rush into these gaps, turning a controlled battle into a chaotic rout. Maintaining formation under pressure was a test of discipline and courage, and soldiers who held firm could help steady faltering lines until reinforcements arrived. Leadership played a role in these moments as well. A commander's quick decisions, such as ordering reserves into action or rallying retreating troops, could restore order and reverse setbacks. Conversely, the loss or capture of a leader could demoralize soldiers and accelerate defeat. Personal bravery, like a knight charging to defend a critical point or a foot soldier standing against overwhelming odds, sometimes bought enough time for a counterattack or regrouping. Surprise attacks and ambushes were also dramatic turning points. Armies that successfully used deception, hidden troops, or unexpected maneuvers could disrupt enemy plans and create openings. Ambushes often caused confusion and fear, with soldiers caught off guard and unable to mount effective resistance. Terrain features like forests, hills, or narrow passes provided ideal locations for such tactics. Environmental factors sometimes influenced turning points. Sudden weather changes, such as a rainstorm, could make weapons or armor slippery and difficult to handle. Muddy ground slowed charges and made movement hazardous. Heat or cold drained soldiers' stamina and affected morale. Commanders had to adapt quickly to these conditions, sometimes calling off attacks or repositioning forces. Supply and fatigue also shaped critical moments. An army running low on food or water could become weak and less willing to fight. Soldiers exhausted from long marches or previous skirmishes lacked the strength to hold lines or press attacks. Conversely, fresh troops brought in as reserves could tip the balance by overwhelming tired enemies. In the aftermath of turning points, the battle's momentum often shifted dramatically. Victorious soldiers pressed their advantage, pursuing fleeing enemies or capturing strategic positions. Defeated troops struggled to regroup, often retreating in disorder. The psychological impact of these moments was profound, influencing not only the battle but the wider war effort and morale back home. By studying these pivotal events, historians gain insight into how medieval battles were won or lost. The complex interplay of tactics, leadership, terrain, and chance shows that success was rarely guaranteed. Every battle was a dynamic contest where a single moment could decide the fate of thousands. The clash of swords and the thunder of hooves eventually faded, leaving behind a battlefield transformed by violence and struggle. What happened after a medieval battle was often as important as the fight itself. Armies faced the difficult tasks of tending to the wounded, burying the dead, and managing the spoils and consequences of victory or defeat. The aftermath shaped the lives of soldiers and civilians alike, and echoed through history as stories of loss, survival, and change. One of the immediate concerns after battle was caring for the injured. Medieval medical knowledge was limited, and battlefield doctors, often monks or specially trained healers, worked under difficult conditions to treat wounds. They cleaned cuts, set broken bones, and tried to stop bleeding. Despite their efforts, many injuries became infected, and survival rates were low. Those too wounded to move were sometimes left behind or taken prisoner. The care of the injured required organization, supplies, and compassion, but also highlighted the harsh realities of medieval warfare. The dead on the battlefield posed another grim challenge. Burial was important for both religious and practical reasons. Bodies left unburied could attract scavengers and spread disease. Often, mass graves were dug quickly to bury large numbers of fallen soldiers. Nobles and knights might receive individual burials or be taken to monasteries or family lands. The sight of the dead reminded survivors of the cost of war, and could affect morale and public opinion back home. Victorious armies often searched the battlefield for spoils, valuable items like weapons, armor, horses, and money. Looting was common, and soldiers expected to be rewarded for their efforts. However, uncontrolled looting sometimes led to disorder and weakened discipline. Commanders tried to regulate the distribution of spoils to maintain order and ensure soldiers were ready for future campaigns. Capturing enemy banners, standards, or leaders was especially prized, symbolizing triumph and boosting morale. The psychological effects of battle lingered long after the fighting ended. Survivors grappled with grief, trauma, and the memories of violence. Some found comfort in religion, rituals, or storytelling, while others struggled with fear or guilt. Tales of heroism and sacrifice became part of local legend and history. The impact on families and communities was profound, with many losing loved ones or facing economic hardship due to the disruption of war. Politically, battles influenced power dynamics and territorial control. Victories could strengthen a ruler's claim to land or throne, while defeats might lead to loss of influence or rebellion. Treaties and negotiations often followed battles, reshaping alliances and borders. Sometimes, the aftermath included negotiations for ransom or release of prisoners, adding a complex human element to warfare. Logistical challenges continued after battle. Armies needed to regroup, resupply, and plan next moves. Marching to a new position, defending captured territory, or preparing for further conflict demanded leadership and resources. The condition of soldiers and horses affected how quickly an army could recover. Some commanders used victory celebrations to boost morale, while others focused on rebuilding and consolidation. Understanding the aftermath helps us see that medieval battles were not isolated events but parts of ongoing struggles with deep social, economic, and political consequences. The efforts to recover and reflect shaped future conflicts, and the course of history itself. Medieval battles did not just shape the outcome of wars, they deeply affected the societies from which the armies were drawn. The repercussions of these conflicts stretched far beyond the battlefield, influencing social structures, economies, cultures, and the everyday lives of common people and nobles alike. To truly understand medieval warfare, we must look at how the experience and consequences of battle reshaped communities and civilizations. One of the most immediate social impacts of battles was the loss of life. While kings and nobles often made the decisions to go to war, the soldiers who fought were frequently peasants, townspeople, or lower-ranked knights. Their deaths caused labor shortages in farms, workshops, and towns, which disrupted food production and economic activity. Families who lost fathers, brothers, or sons faced hardships and uncertainty. The loss of a generation of men in prolonged wars could change demographic balances, slowing growth and development in affected regions. Wars also affected social mobility. Some common soldiers who demonstrated bravery or skill in battle earned rewards such as land, titles, or money, allowing them to rise in status. This upward movement, while rare, showed that battlefields could be places where courage and opportunity intersected. Conversely, nobles who lost battles or were captured risked losing lands and power, sometimes leading to the decline of powerful families or shifts in political influence. Battles acted as catalysts for change in the social order, sometimes reinforcing traditions and other times challenging them. The economic impact of warfare was profound. Maintaining armies required resources, money, food, weapons, and armor. Taxation often increased to fund wars, burdening peasants and townspeople who already lived modestly. Trade routes could be disrupted by conflict or the threat of raids, limiting access to goods and markets. Castles and towns might be damaged or destroyed, requiring costly repairs. The financial strain of war influenced rulers' decisions and shaped long-term economic policies. Culturally, battles influenced art, literature, and folklore. Songs and stories of heroic deeds, tragic losses, and famous commanders became part of the collective memory. These tales served both to entertain and to teach values such as honor, loyalty, and courage. Monasteries and churches sometimes commissioned works commemorating battles or fallen heroes, blending religious themes with historical events. The memory of battles was preserved not only in written chronicles but in oral traditions passed down through generations. The experience of war also affected religion and belief. Battles were often seen as tests of divine favor, with victory interpreted as a sign of God's approval. Prayers, blessings, and rituals before and after battles were common, seeking protection or giving thanks. Sometimes, religious orders took part in warfare directly, as in the Crusades or the campaigns of military monks like the Knights Templar. The mingling of faith and conflict shaped medieval spirituality and justified war as a righteous endeavor. For the common people, the presence of armies could be both a source of danger and opportunity. Armies needed supplies and shelter, leading to requisitions or forced contributions from villages and towns. This sometimes caused resentment and hardship, especially if soldiers behaved badly or stayed too long. On the other hand, armies could provide protection against raiders or rival factions, and victory in battle could bring peace and stability. The relationship between soldiers and civilians was complex and varied depending on circumstances. Technological and tactical advances made during wars often spread into civilian life. Improvements in metallurgy, for example, influenced tool and building technology. The organization and logistics of armies inspired administrative reforms in towns and kingdoms. Innovations in communication, such as the use of signals or messengers, found applications beyond warfare. Thus, the impact of battle extended into the development of medieval society in unexpected ways. Finally, battles could change the political landscape dramatically. Victories expanded territories, secured borders, and legitimized rulers. Defeats could lead to loss of lands, influence, or even the throne. Alliances were formed or broken based on military outcomes. In some cases, prolonged warfare exhausted kingdoms, paving the way for new powers to rise. The legacy of battle was written not just in the records of kings but in the shifting map of medieval Europe and beyond. In conclusion, medieval battles were not isolated conflicts fought on distant fields. They were events that rippled through the fabric of society, influencing every aspect of life from economy to culture, religion to politics. The bravery and suffering of soldiers echoed in the homes and hearts of their communities, shaping history in profound and lasting ways. As the dust settled on countless medieval battlefields, the stories of those who fought lived on, growing into legends that captured the imaginations of generations. These tales, passed down through oral tradition, poetry, chronicles, and later literature, helped shape our understanding of the past, blending fact with myth to create a vivid tapestry of heroism, tragedy, and adventure. Exploring how battles became stories reveals much about the values, culture, and memory of medieval societies. Medieval chroniclers played a key role in preserving accounts of battles. Monks and scribes in monasteries carefully recorded events, often from the perspective of their patrons or kingdoms. These written histories mix detailed descriptions with moral lessons, presenting battles as struggles between good and evil, or tests of faith and honor. While their accuracy varied, these chronicles remain valuable windows into the medieval mindset and the importance placed on warfare. Oral storytelling was equally important. Before widespread literacy, bards, minstrels, and troubadours entertained and informed people with songs and poems recounting famous battles. These performances emphasized dramatic moments, brave deeds, and tragic losses, using vivid language and music to engage listeners. The repetition and adaptation of these stories helped them evolve over time, sometimes embellishing details or adding supernatural elements, making the past come alive. The creation of heroic figures was central to these legends. Knights, commanders, and even common soldiers were transformed into larger-than-life characters embodying virtues admired by society: courage, loyalty, and honor. Stories of single combat, daring escapes, or miraculous victories inspired listeners and reinforced social ideals. These heroes became symbols of identity and pride for regions, families, and nations, their exploits commemorated in festivals, art, and literature. Mythical elements often blended with historical facts. Tales of divine intervention, enchanted weapons, or magical creatures joined accounts of real battles, reflecting the medieval worldview where the natural and supernatural were intertwined. Such stories served to explain mysterious or overwhelming events, providing meaning and hope amid the chaos of war. They also reinforced the idea that battles were part of a larger cosmic struggle between forces of good and evil. The cultural impact of these stories extended beyond entertainment. They influenced political legitimacy, with rulers using legendary ancestors or victories to justify their rule. Psalms and poems stirred patriotism and unity, encouraging support for ongoing conflicts. Monuments, such as statues or chapels, were erected to honor heroes and battles, making memory tangible in the landscape. Over time, these narratives contributed to the shaping of national identities. The process of remembering battles was selective and often shaped by those in power. Victories were celebrated and preserved, while defeats might be downplayed or forgotten. Different groups remembered the same events in contrasting ways, leading to competing versions of history. This highlights how history and myth are not static but constantly negotiated in society, reflecting changing values and needs. In modern times, these medieval stories continue to captivate audiences, inspiring books, movies, and games. While historians work to separate fact from fiction, the power of legend remains strong. These narratives connect us to the past in ways that pure facts cannot, reminding us of the human experience behind the battles, the hopes, fears, and dreams of those who lived through them. In conclusion, the transformation of medieval battles into stories and legends reveals the enduring importance of memory and storytelling in human culture. Through these tales, the past is kept alive, not just as history, but as a shared heritage that shapes identity and imagination across centuries. As our journey through the echoes of medieval battles comes to a close, I invite you to take a deep breath and let your mind drift softly away from the clashing swords and thunderous hoofs. Imagine the quiet fields where once warriors stood, now calm under the gentle embrace of evening's peace. If you enjoyed exploring history with me, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to you. Wherever and whenever you're listening, may this moment bring you calm and comfort. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let the soothing quiet carry you gently into rest. Good night, and until next time,